you can be compliant with a framework and not secure. Because frameworks are about checking boxes, but if you don't have the holistic puzzle built with all the key pieces, you're going to have holes, you're going to have exposures, and you're still going to get broken into. Welcome to Life of a CISO. I'm Dr. Eric Cole, your host, and we'll be taking you on a journey each week on what it takes to be a CISO and what are solutions that you can implement today if you are currently a Chief Information Security Officer or if you want to be one in the future. This is Life of a CISO. Welcome, my friends. You know what time it is. It's time for Life of a CISO with yours truly. The good doctor is in the house. Hope you are doing awesome and you are crushing it midway through the year and you are on track with your targets. I've been getting a lot of requests of Eric. Why don't you talk about frameworks? Why don't you talk about compliance? Why don't you talk about all those different areas? And the reality is most companies are not ready for it. You have to get foundational things in place before you start layering in frameworks and compliance and all those other pieces. Because the reality is you can be compliant with a framework and not secure. Because frameworks are about checking boxes, but if you don't have the holistic puzzle built with all the key pieces, you're going to have holes, you're going to have exposures, and you're still going to get broken into. So I always focus on cybersecurity first. The foundation is what I focus on. Then to me, once you have a solid foundation, then you start the house that you build on the foundation. That's your frameworks. And then the specific way each room is designed and built, that's compliance. But it has to be done in that order, because if you're building the house without the foundation, or you're trying to be compliant where you're designing the rooms without a house and without a foundation, you'll see that doesn't work. And I'm always reminded of a company I was working with. They were a smaller but very, very high net worth company. The amount of revenue they were bringing in for the size of the company would blow your mind. And they were having regular breaches. They were getting compromised, they were getting phished. Almost every month there was some problem or issue. So they basically fired the entire IT team, the CIO. They kept the bare bones staff, and they brought me in as an emergency triage to get security back in shape. So I focused solely on let's get foundational things. Let's start getting the risk posture. Let's getting our risk tolerance. Let's start going in and securing what we have and looking at cost-benefit analysis for new security. And I got them to a point where we had a basic foundation, and we went about 7 months with no major breaches, no major incidents. Well, then the CEO was like, okay, I want to build back the team. I want to build back and bring in a CIO. And they brought in a CIO from a very large government organization. Very large, very mature. And I was sort of like, guys, I don't think this is a good match here, because this is a small, nimble, adaptive, almost, they've been around for a while, but it's almost startup mode where you got to be very flexible and open. And this person in the interview wasn't. He worked for the government. He always worked for the government, very structured, very format, very regimented, very framework oriented. And I'm like, I don't think it's going to be a good match. But it was one of those where he was a friend of a friend, and they sort of vouched for him and wanted him in. So they sort of snuck him in where it wasn't really a good match. And I remember our first meeting, he's like, Eric, show me all our framework documents and compliance. And I'm like, dude, do you understand where this organization was 7 months ago? Do you realize what you're dealing with? You are not even close to ready to talk about frameworks or compliance. I said, you're coming from the government, which is very stable, very big, very secure, very large. I said, this is a different beast. You need to sort of revamp and let me help you and show you what's going on. Well, all he kept saying was, Eric, you must have a framework. If you don't have a framework, you don't know what you're doing and you're hacking it and blah, blah, like just all the, so finally I was just like, dude, I went back to the CEO and I said, call me in 6 months when you're back to where you were and I'll fix it again for you. And he sort of looked at me. I'm like, nothing against this guy. He doesn't get it. He's not the right person for the job. He wants to implement large government stringent security practices, and that's not this company. So we left on good terms. Well, I left on good terms with the CEO. And sure enough, 5 months later, I get the call and we started over again. They fired that CIO and we had to start all over again. So the point is, sometimes we get way too caught up on advanced skills when we don't know the basics. The analogy I like to give is a friend of mine was coaching a basketball team and they were awful. They were losing every game. So they asked if I'd come and help them out. So I show up to practice and they're sitting there watching video of like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and these top guys. And these kids are trying to like do 3-pointers from midcourt, behind the back, double reverse, slams. And I'm like, they can't even dribble the freaking ball. They're trying to do all these advanced skills. So I asked him if I could take over for a month. All we did for an entire month was the basics. I said, if I see anybody during a game trying to shoot a 3-pointer, I'm benching you. And they're like, but why? I'm like, because you don't know how. It's really that simple. You don't know how to do it, so why are you throwing the ball away? You've never made a single 3-pointer in any game, so why are we trying things? I said, all we're doing is dribbling, passing, layups, and short shots. We're mastering the basics. And that's all I want you to do in the game. And guess what? We started winning games. We started doing good. Because if you don't have your basic skills, you're not going to be able to handle the advance. And I feel like that's the mindset of a lot of companies. They want to bring in frameworks and compliance, but if you don't have the basic skills, that basic foundation in place, you end up going to cause a lot of extra work, a lot of documentation, a lot of confusion, and it's not necessarily going to lead to the organization being locked down, protected, or secured. Now, frameworks taken in the context of let's use them to sort of see where we need to enhance our programs, where we need to add new components, where we need documentation, are all critical key things for medium to large size companies. Large size companies are going to have to be compliant. They're going to have to be compliant with some framework. But the point is, let's focus on foundation cybersecurity first. So let's start. What are the basics? What are the basics of cybersecurity that you need and must have in place in order for frameworks and compliance to be effective? First and foremost, what are you protecting? What is your critical data? If you don't know what critical data is, if you don't know what data is PII, PHI, and what categories it is for the different compliance, how are you going to be compliant? Because here's the challenge. One of the biggest mistakes organizations do that have to be compliant, like with PHI or PCI or any of those, they try to make the entire organization. I will tell you right now, if you try to make the entire organization, every single person, entity, everything in the company, PCI compliant, it is going to be a disaster. Because way too complex, way too large a project, and it's going to inhibit many people in the company that are not dealing with credit cards, that are not processing credit cards, that have nothing to do with credit cards. Why do they need to follow all that compliance? Why do they need to have all that regulation? And if everybody's included, then all of a sudden your possibility for being non-compliant grows. So one of the big tricks when we're talking about regulations and compliance is segmentation. Let's understand the company. Let's understand all the data that you're processing. And then let's determine what subset of information or subset of data has to be compliant. And then let's segment all of that out on its own network and make just that piece compliant. That's how you win the game, my friends. And that's one of the things we've done a lot with these companies where they've been trying to be compliant for 5 years. They're getting fines, they're getting regulations, they're never passing a single audit, there's frustration, they keep firing people, bringing in new people, and then we finally come in and we get them compliant within 7 months. And the exec is like, how did you do it? And how I did it was I properly defined the problem to be the smallest possible domain it could be. So now I essentially went in and made only 15% of the company PCI compliant. But guess what? Only 15% of the company needed to be. So that's the trick. The first foundational item is understanding your environment. What is your critical data? Where is it located? And what is the various risks and exposures of that critical data? Which critical data has to be covered by which regulations, which frameworks, which components? And now we're starting to segment, isolate, and break down the problem. But notice what we're doing first. We're gaining awareness and understanding of what the problem is. Do you know what your critical data is, what the exposure is, what the risk is, and what regulations you must apply to each one of those data sets? No, that's first. Next, where is that data located? Now here's where so many companies get into trouble. Because I will tell you, I go into a company and I say, what is your critical data? They tell me, and then I say, where is it located? And they're like, okay, it's located on these 4 servers. And guess what? I go in, and it is located on those first 4 servers. Great job. What's the issue? It's also located on 3 other servers that they didn't know about. Now, if you do all this work, energy, and effort to make these 4 servers compliant and you forget about these other 3, that's why you're going to fail. That's why you're going to get in trouble, because they don't understand the problem set. So the other thing we need to do is control and manage the flow of data. Restrict where critical data can be stored. Control and manage where it can be stored. Set up segments, set up boundaries, and start isolating and segmenting off the critical pieces of data. Now, what is the one area that is probably going to get you into the most trouble? It's what you would call laptops or desktops. It's what I would personally call a portable server. Let's go back 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a state-of-the-art server that was in your data center that was processing and managing critical data would typically have 2 CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM, and 4 terabytes of storage. Go and look at a typical laptop today. Today's laptops are not laptops. Today's laptops are portable servers. Now let me ask you a question. With the speed of the internet, connectivity anywhere, and access to information anywhere, anyplace, anytime, why are we letting our users have 4 terabytes of storage? Why are we letting every single user create an exposure point? Because now, if users are storing critical data on their laptops, portable servers, and one of those laptops gets stolen or compromised, you're no longer compliant, you have a major incident, and you have to report it. So why are we still allowing people to store data locally? I know this is a huge paradigm shift, but this is one whose time has come. You need to seriously, in your company, start looking at thin clients. So it's seriously looking at reducing and minimizing hard drive space. Why are we letting people store data on their hard drives? I will tell you, I do a lot of expert witness work, and discovery is always a key part. What can you discover about what the company did? Now, of course, companies have strict retention policies. We're only going to keep our logs for a certain period of time. We're only going to keep this. We're only going to keep that. And they basically do that to restrict their exposure and liability. So now if there is some sort of dispute or legal matter against the company, they've contained and controlled the information. They're controlling how many logs and information in detail are stored, the data, the archive. Everything is very nicely controlled and managed at a general cyber IT level across all the key servers. You know what always gets them into trouble? Laptops. I always go in when I'm working, depending on which side I'm on, and I'm like, okay, start going in and requesting images of the laptops of these individuals. Start asking, so go in and depose these individuals and see if they have any hard drives, any local storage, anything. And 90% of the time they do, and 90% that has all the information, because guess what? The company was very diligent on removing logs and very diligent on what they stored and archived, but the individuals weren't. So now you have all these portable servers that are representing exposure and risk points to the company. So that's something most companies have ignored and don't want to deal with, but the time of letting users have portable servers, my friends, have come and gone. You really need to start looking at thin clients. You need to start looking at cloud-based storage and cloud-based solutions and ways that all your information and data is controlled and managed on servers that you manage and control. Because here's the reality. You don't manage and control laptops. You don't manage and control desktops. So you need to get that taken care of and under control. So our first most critical step on the path to frameworks and compliance is getting control of your data. What is your data? Where is it located? What regulations does it need to abide by? And then start segmenting and isolating out those data stores. So now you have small little segments of critical data that have to meet certain frameworks, but not all of your data or your entire network has to meet every single framework. Once we have our data under control and we know what our critical data is, where it's located, the next foundational item is, what is your company's risk posture? What risks are you willing to accept? Because here's the reality. 100% security in any practical sense doesn't exist. If you're going to run a company that has functionality, is making money, you will not be 100% secure. Because the rule is simple. The only way to have 100% security is zero functionality. The rule or law of cybersecurity, just like the law of gravity, whether you believe it or not, it's always at play. The law of cybersecurity is when you add functionality, you decrease security. To put the law another way, the law says when you add functionality, you increase risk. And it's funny because I talk to people, I give presentations, and they always come back and go, Eric, I don't know if I agree with that law. Guess what? The universe doesn't care. The universe doesn't go, okay, let's see if Sally or Johnny agree with it, and if they do, then it applies. No. Guess what? The law of gravity is always applying. You can go in and ignore it. Go for it. Go to a 10-story building and say, I don't believe in the law of gravity, and step off the building. And what will happen? You'll be introduced to the law of gravity. So if you don't believe in the law of security, go in and add a ton of functionality, and after you get a major breach, then you can realize the law does exist. So the reality is, if you have any functionality at all, or like most companies, a very functional rich environment, you're going to have risk. So you need to accept some of it. Because here's the reality. If you don't accept any risk, your company can't function. So there has to be some level of risk that your company accepts that cybersecurity is okay with. Because otherwise, what happens? The old method. The old method where companies acted like they had no risk posture and no risk was acceptable. Here's what happened. Vice presidents, directors, business leaders would go and make decisions on launching new products, launching new solutions, launching new applications. And cybersecurity would come in and be like, nope, can't do it. Risk, 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 risk. And they'd basically be like, go away. Because here's the problem with no risk posture. The business units have all the authority, but cybersecurity has all the responsibility, which means nobody has to listen to cybersecurity. So what ends up happening when you don't have a risk posture is every risk is ignored, security is put on the sideline, nobody listens to them, and companies do whatever the heck they want. Then they have a major, major breach, and what do you think happens? They go in, and that vice president of that business unit that ignored security, didn't listen to security, and basically blatantly put the company at risk, they're the ones that get fired, right? Nope. They get promoted. Cybersecurity, who pointed out every risk, said it was wrong, said it couldn't be done, said it's going to lead to a breach, and they were totally and completely ignored, they're fired. And then the company repeats the cycle, and it never gets better. You can't have a situation where you know something exists, but the person responsible for it has no authority, but ultimate responsibility. That's a death wish. That's why security has been such a mess in so many companies. That's why security has failed in so many ways, because it wasn't structured correctly. So what you need to have instead is a risk posture. These risks are acceptable. So Mr. and Mrs. Business Unit, if you're going to go in and implement solutions that have this level of risk, you're good. We're going to allow it. The company agreed to this risk posture. We're fine. But if you go against it, if you're doing something that is outside the scope of that risk, cybersecurity will tell you and give you solutions. Then they will put it on a risk list and present to the executive board every single month. So every month, the CEO, COO, CFO are all going to see business units that are implementing unacceptable risk. And then they are the final arbitrator. They then can finally arbitrate saying, okay, in this case, it's okay, and we're going to allow it. Or in this case, it's not okay, and you're going to get in trouble for not listening to security. They told you not to do it. You did it anyway, and we're going to back security. Don't do that again. But now what you're doing is you're balancing it out. It's no longer the situation where business units can run wild, have all the authority, no responsibility, nobody listens to security, and security gets fired when breaches happen. That must be changed, and the only way of changing it is with a risk posture. Third, the decision of accepting risk needs to be put in the hands of the business owner. So right now, the business owner loves it. They have all the authority and none of the responsibility. That is a recipe for disaster. What we need to do instead is flip it. Now the business unit needs to have all the responsibility and all the authority. They need both. And here's how you do it. Training them. Cybersecurity is never yes or no. People always come up to me when I meet them at a party or at other settings. They're like, oh, you do cybersecurity? You're going to tell me what not to do. I'm like, never. They're like, really? No, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. First question I'm going to ask, what is the value and benefit? What is the value and benefit you get from doing this? Then I'm going to ask you, what is the risk or exposure? And then it's simple. Is the benefit worth the risk? That's all I'm going to ask you. If you come back and go, heck yeah, Eric, this benefit is so worth the risk. Great, do it. Because guess what? Business and life is all about risk. It's all about taking risk, but here's the trick. It's all taking calculated risk. If you're taking a calculated risk where you outwardly know the risk and you're willing to accept it, game on. I have no problem with that. That's called being a leader. That's called being a decision maker. What I have a problem with is you making a decision ignorant of the risk. You making a decision where you have no idea there's any risk, you don't want anything to do with it, you ignore it, and you're like, I don't care. I want this so bad, I'm willing to take any risk. No, that's dangerous. Great example of this is when the Alexa devices first came out. Everybody thought they were so cool. You mean I can say, Alexa, what is the weather? I can say, play a song. That's so cool. Gotta have it. And sales went through the roof. Everybody put Alexas everywhere. They loved it. But nobody ever asked the question, what is the risk of exposure? Then it started coming out that Alexa is basically listening and recording all your conversations. And I love this because people are like, no, it's not. I'm like, wait, I have a question for you. If it's not listening to what you're saying, how does it answer you? And everyone's like, oh. And guess what happened? Everyone started ripping Alexas out of their house because they finally went in and said, wait, the risk is everything we're doing, everything we're saying is recorded. And now when they said, is the benefit worth the risk? They said, heck no. And everyone started pulling them out. So that's the third piece with security. Final piece. What are the threats and vulnerabilities? And here's the magic. And this is where we really start bridging the gap with the frameworks and the compliance. Cybersecurity is all about risk. It's all about understanding, managing, and mitigating the risk of our critical assets being disclosed, altered, or denied access. We've already talked about critical assets and all that. So the final piece we're talking about is risk. Risk is the probability for loss. Risk is really composed of two things: threats and vulnerabilities. Threat is the potential for harm. What are things that could cause harm to your organization? Vulnerabilities are weaknesses that allow those threats to manifest themselves. So a threat is a phishing attack. A vulnerability is users that click on attachments. The fact that users will click on any attachment is a vulnerability. The phishing is the threat. Together, that creates a high-risk item. But really, what we're looking at when we're starting to tie to frameworks is I want to say, what is the likelihood of the threat and what is the impact of the vulnerability? Because here's the reality. If there's a threat that has a low likelihood, who cares? If there's a vulnerability that has a low impact, who cares? So what we're really starting to do is now create our risk matrix where our risks of critical, high, medium, and low are not based on the threat or the vulnerability. It's based on what is the likelihood of that threat and what is the impact that vulnerability can have. And now, when we get in these situations where we start having risks that have a high likelihood and a high impact, that's when we start taking action. That's when we start paying attention. Because here's the reality. There are so many vulnerabilities out there, it's hard to fix all of them. And this is where companies get into trouble. They'll run these vulnerability scans or create these long lists, and they just start fixing random vulnerabilities. Like I heard somebody go in once and go, oh, just start fixing the low-hanging fruit. Because this way you show you're doing a lot of action. So this way you can show in 6 months you fixed 100 vulnerabilities. But I'm like, but wait, you spend all your time, all your energy, and all your effort fixing vulnerabilities that have no likelihood or no impact. Isn't that a waste? I would have rather you fix 5 vulnerabilities that have high likelihood and high impact than 100 vulnerabilities with low likelihood, low impact. So it's prioritizing and fixing the most critical vulnerabilities. Now, once you go in and you know your critical data, you segment your network, you isolate out and you identify the types of data and the servers they reside on, you then put together your risk posture. You then start making a risk-based decision. Is the value and benefit worth the risk and exposure? And then you start prioritizing risks. Then, my friends, you are well on your way to then start rolling in some of the general concepts of framework and compliance.